Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 140. Today's guest is Dayna Patterson. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today I'm talking with poet Dayna Patterson. Dayna Patterson is a photographer, textile artist, and irreverent bardophile. She is the author of Oh Lady, Speak Again, published by Signature Books in 2023, and If Mother Braids a Waterfall, published by Signature Books in 2020. Honors include the Association for Mormon Letters Poetry Award and the 2019 Dignity Not Detention Poetry Prize, judged by Ilya Kaminsky. Her creative work has appeared in Ecotheo, Kenyon Review, and Poetry. She's the founding editor, now emerita, of Psaltery and Lyre, and a co-editor of Dove Song, Heavenly Mother in Mormon Poetry. She lives with her husband and 2 kids in a little patch of forest in the Pacific Northwest. As you'll hear, Dayna and I talked for today's conversation about her new collection, Oh Lady, Speak Again. Many of the poems in this book, perhaps most of them, are written in the voices of the women characters from Shakespeare's plays, including Macbeth, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, King Lear, Hamlet, and The Merchant of Venice. Yet, although so many of the poems are written in persona, Dayna uses these characters' voices to talk about and through issues and experiences from her own life, things like patriarchy, motherhood, sexuality, religion, and heritage, often in ways that also recontextualize the characters and their motivations from a powerfully feminist perspective. It was really an interesting read, not least because at certain points in the book, Dayna explicitly highlights and interrogates her own use of persona in these poems, which complicates the narrative in a fascinating way. I've put links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copies of Oh Lady, Speak Again from Village Books in Bellingham, Washington, from the Book Catapult here in San Diego, California, and from bookshop.org. But, as always, if you're able to order from an independent bookstore in your own town, I highly recommend doing that. For subscribers to the KTCO Patreon, Dayna was gracious enough to add a reading to our bonus audio archive. She read her poem Red-Handed. That joins readings from past guests, including Liz Lenz, Ada Limon, Luther Hughes, Rachel Zucker, Nicole Chung, and many more. If you've been listening to and enjoying the conversations I have here, you can help support the show by making a monthly pledge at patreon.com/likewisemedia, and that will give you access to the full bonus audio archive. Okay, let's get started, shall we? Here's my conversation with Dayna Patterson. I really enjoyed this collection. I reread the whole thing last night again as I was preparing to talk with you today, and I liked it even better on the second time around. I was wondering if we could start with a reading.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. I'm going to read one of the early poems in the collection. This is Oh is the Sound of Tragedy. It's a very sound-driven poem, and the title comes directly from something that one of my Shakespeare professors in grad school said as we were discussing a passage of King Lear. I was noticing all of these oh sounds as he's raging against the storm. And I was like, why? What's going on with all these oh sounds? And she's like, well, oh is the sound of tragedy. So I stole that and turned it into this poem with that title. Oh is the sound of tragedy. Oh, as in Romeo's doomed romance, as in Juliet's hopeless wound. Oh, for the little moan in Desdemona, Alpha and Omega of Othello, Nous at the end of Iago. Oh, as the coward in Antony, whose auto-destruct proved too slow. Oh, of Cleopatra's poison, the coiled asp of her final show. As in Lear's blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage, blow, his crawl toward old. Oh, as in woe, open mouth circle, hole in our faces, exit of groans, flow where flies or food may go. My mother's float, my father's snow, my faith in the whole, holy, wholly broke. Oh, for the gone in Goneril. Oh, as in go, run, revoke the order for Cordelia's. Oh, no. Oh, for the double O's of Gloucester's eyes, the twin O's in look, which he can't because O is for out, vile jelly. Oh, as in mold, fold, follow folly, fall into nothing, no thing, to zero. Oh, as in globe, rotundity of the world, loaded with the O of sorrow. Oh, probes and prones, look, 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 look to see so much and know. O says, no, no, no life, no breath, no more. Ghost, poor fool, undo. O for ambition's goad, for the smoke of Macbeth's unholy goal. O for Ophelia drowned, for Hamlet's lost crown, his dying throes, his O, I die, Horatio, his O. 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 O.
Thank you. For the readers who can't actually see the poem on the page, also, it's worth noting that this poem takes the shape of an O on the page. One of the things that I was kind of thinking about as I was reading through these poems, some of the poems like this one are very sound-based, and others are less so. It seems like, but the poems take a lot of different forms on the page. Some of the poems, for example, a number of them have to do with or include these lists of colors. There are, I think, 4 or 5 of those poems that repeat throughout the collection. And what it was sort of making me wonder a little bit is how you, as a writer, sort of find your way into a poem. I know that some of the poets that I've talked to before often start with an image. Some, like Kazimali, are very sound-based with almost all of their poems. And so I thought that might be a good place to start with this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm a bit of a restless experimenter. I mean, there are several self-portrait poems, for example, and there are those color poems that are spread throughout the collection, but I do like to try a lot of different approaches. And I think when I get into a groove that starts to feel tired, I want to jump out of that and to destabilize that in some way. So maybe I'll try a form I haven't tried, or try to write about a character I haven't written before. A lot of these poems are inspired by female characters from Shakespeare, and there are several that didn't make it into the book. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking. It
does. I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm always sort of curious about, just in terms of creative process, is, it's sort of too broad a question to just ask it directly, right? But it's like, where does the art come from?
Yeah.
I think all of us as artists have a certain impulse to make things, but oftentimes, and I don't know if this is how it is for you, but for myself, it can be really hard to just get started. And so sometimes it almost has to be like a way of tricking yourself into doing something. And for myself, like if I'm going to write a poem, it usually doesn't start with the language. It usually starts more with the image. Like it'll be something that I can't quite get out of my head, And, I spoke with Gabrielle Bates earlier this year, and she also, the image is often where it starts. But then when I've spoken with other folks, sometimes the language itself is more the thing that will get started. Like it'll be a phrase or even just a sound. And like with this particular poem, the sound is such an integral part of what the language is doing, but also not just the words that you've chosen as the author of the poem, but also the words that you're talking about, Shakespeare's words, right? So it's sort of finding that entry point from the creative side of it, rather than because we can talk about entry points as a reader as well. But for me, that question of how do you find your way into a poem is always an interesting one for me anyway.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot because it's National Poetry Writing Month this month. And I don't know if you were writing a poem a day for NaPoWriMo. Do you do that, Mike?
I do not.
Yeah. I've been doing it for several years with the same group. And we post a poem a day in a closed Facebook group. And so that question is very much on my mind right now, especially it's day 21 of NaPoWriMo, and I'm feeling like I'm running really dry. Like, where is the next poem going to come from? And sometimes I have like a backlog of ideas, things that have gotten under my skin, they're bothering me a little bit, that I know that I want to write about. So I'll start off the month of April with sometimes lots of ideas, and hopefully not just the month of April, but it does certainly give me an impetus to write, knowing that there's this peer pressure, this wonderful peer pressure to post something every day. Yeah, like in the case of this particular poem, it was that sentence from my professor, "O is the sound of tragedy," that I pulled and started looking for other O's. O sounds both in Shakespeare's language and just how many O's can I stuff into this one space? But I think it's not always the image and it's not always the sound. I don't know that I can point to one thing in particular and say that's where my poems come from. Sometimes it's a form. Lately, as we're headed towards the end of April, I'm like, let me see if I can scrounge together a villanelle. Like, here's the form. Let's see if I can do it. See if I can fill it up like a container.
So yeah. You mentioned, and it's obvious when you're reading the collection, a lot of these poems, I would say the majority of them are based around the women characters in Shakespeare's plays. And even the title is a line from one of the women characters, from Emilia in Othello. And this line, the first time we encountered it is on the cover, of course, because it's the title. We also encounter it in the first poem, the Dramatis Personae, where it's repeated several times through that poem. One of the things that was interesting to me is, like everybody, I read Shakespeare in high school and in college, but I haven't made a huge study of it since then. So, reading this collection gave me an opportunity to sort of go back and refamiliarize myself with the plays, some of which I had known very well when I was younger and some of which I'd never read before. And so initially I hadn't realized that exactly what line the title came from, but it's interesting to me that it comes from, well, first of all, Emilia is not a character that, as far as I can recall, is named anywhere else or at all in the collection. But this is the scene where Othello murders Desdemona, and Emilia, her sort of role in this is to come in and be speaking truth, right? But this is something that she says to Desdemona as Desdemona is dying. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how the title, how this line sort of popped out for you, what it was about that made it what you'd want the collection. Like, obviously the title is sort of the first thing that most of us are going to encounter about a book, right? So can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Titles are hard. I was very close to naming this book Turn Good Lady. I think Oh Lady Speak Again is a better title. I'm glad that is where it's stuck. But you're right. Emilia doesn't appear she's not named anywhere else in the book. But it's this really strange moment in Othello where, as you say, Desdemona has just been suffocated to death. And she comes back to life and starts speaking again, like protesting her innocence. And she stops speaking, and Emilia petitions her to continue speaking, even though she has died. She's speaking from the dead. And then when she's said her piece, she dies for reals, or stops speaking from the dead. So I love that idea of taking canonical Shakespeare and speaking back to that shaking off the dust, burning off the rust, pushing against the iconic image of Shakespeare and writing new stories, new endings, new ideas into these canonical characters and texts.
Yeah, and there are actually a few different poems in the collection that are really explicitly about this idea of sort of rewriting Shakespeare, for example, in this version, which is one of the early poems, you're imagining different endings for all of these characters. And there's a poem shortly after that called And Why Not Change the Story, where you're talking about how Shakespeare himself rewrote a lot of the stories because he didn't come up with most of the stories. They were adapted from stories that were already out in the world. And so if he can do it, then why not us?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. They didn't have the same idea of authorship or ownership or copyright that we have. Shakespeare rarely wrote from his own mind, or even like setting a play in England in contemporary time. That didn't happen very often. He was drawing on histories and stories and fables, and rarely didn't use source texts. So of course we should mess around and demythologize and knock him off his throne a lot.
And it's interesting because I think at this point, our understanding of Shakespeare is to really put him as well as so many of the other sort of canonical Western writers, most of whom, of course, are men, to put them up on this pedestal and sort of separate their work from just everyday humanity, which is, I find really interesting to note, of course, that in his own time, Shakespeare was, a popular writer. And even for a long time, Shakespeare was considered to be, the plays were often considered to be sort of more popular entertainment than as highbrow as we consider him to be now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the sort of questions that I was thinking about as I'm reading these poems, especially with these couple of poems that are so explicitly about sort of editing the story or rewriting the story or the story being mutable, because so many of the poems are drawing from, as far as I can tell, right, the poems are drawing from your own experiences as a person, drawing from the author's experience, right, and presenting your own story. Not to say that like poems are the same thing as autobiography, but it's a common thing for us to, as artists, to draw from our own life experiences to create the art that we make. And what I was sort of thinking about is, can we, or to what extent can we apply this idea to our own stories? That are our own stories mutable? Can we change the stories that we have about ourselves, our families, our life histories, our futures? Do we do that? And how can we do that? I realize that's kind of like a big philosophical question, but it was something that came up for me as I was reading these poems, especially the second time. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I love that idea that our own stories are mutable. I mean, I think that psychologists and cognitive scientists are coming to this notion that every time we dip back into our memory, we change the memory a little bit. And so the things that we remember the most often are the memories we've actually changed the most, which is a little bit terrifying. Like where are the boundaries of what we can say that we remember and what our own memory is fabricating? I like the idea of, well, every time we bring parts of ourselves to the page and write into the poem, we're dipping back into memory and maybe changing the memory a little bit and presenting an aspect of ourselves or parts of ourselves, plural, because we're not just a self, right? We are always selves and multiple and complex. And so selecting a piece of that and dipping back into our mutable memory, maybe we don't have any choice but to put a mutable, changeable, revised self onto the page, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you're touching on something really, really interesting that I don't know if it had occurred to me, that this impulse to revise Shakespeare is maybe also an impulse to revise my own life and my own memories.
I think that there is an aspect of that comes through in the poems themselves. The speaker of these poems, I always try to be careful about conflating the speaker of a poem with the author. But, in doing a little bit of reading of some of your other prose writing or interviews that you've done, there are things that the speaker of these poems talks about that are definitely drawn from your own life. One of those being talking about discovering your mother's sort of coming out process, or how the process of your mother coming out to you as a queer person. That's something that is talked about in several of these poems. And in particular, it's not just that the speaker of the poems is talking about, okay, my mother came out to me. I didn't understand my mother, but also I didn't understand myself. And the story that I had about what was happening in my life was something that I didn't understand. And so as we move through the collection, I feel like there's a definite arc of the speaker of the poems sort of identifying the ways in which she didn't understand her own story before and is coming to understand it. I don't know about better, but at least differently as we move through these poems and as we move through the personal history of the speaker of these poems. Does that seem fair to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely transcribes a trajectory of the speaker coming to know herself better and coming to know her mother better, understand differently. And you're right that the speakers in these poems are very, very close to me and myself, my story. And many folks have stories of their kids coming out to them as queer, and maybe, or maybe a more common trope is like a religious parent has a queer child come out to them. And in my case, it was the reverse. I was a very religious person, and my mom came out to me. I was raised by my dad and my stepmom. My mom was out of my life for a long time. And so I have this kind of reversal of my mom coming out to me when I was in my late 20s. And that is a core part of the story of this book.
Yeah. I think this question of, what you said, the speaker being very close to yourself. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's that is a thing that's true for many poets. It's certainly true for my own poetry. The I in my poems is basically just myself. And, it's not unusual, but I feel like with this particular set of poems, especially the ones that are titled self-portrait, of which there are a lot, it's certainly the most common title in the collection is self-portrait as so-and-so. And the way in which the I in these poems is ostensibly the character from Shakespeare. So, self-portrait as Cordelia, self-portrait as Titania, self-portrait as, whichever one of these characters. And some of them are revisited several times through the collection. But there's this interesting thing about the I in these particularly in the self-portrait poems, which are written in persona, but also kind of not. And this separation between the character of Shakespeare's, the speaker of the poem, and the poet, I feel like that's one of the things that makes these poems so interesting and alive, is that tension between these three sort of triangulation points, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's obviously very important to these poems that they are engaging with that tension of what is the I in these poems? Who is the I? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I had been reading a lot of Jory Graham and her wonderful series of self-portrait poems. And I think that's what got me started experimenting with the self-portrait. But then you have a self-portrait as a character that invites a kind of tension. Are you the character or is it the self? Who is it? Who is the I? And I went back and forth on maybe I don't need the self-portrait part in the title because people know that there's a speaker and they can guess how close the speaker is to the poet. It gets very tangly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I decided in the end, I like that tension. I like the complexity of self-portrait as Miranda after shipwreck. So there's me, the poet, there's the speaker in the poem, there's a self-portrait, and there's also Miranda. And it complicates and diffuses what we mean by the self, I think. It's also in the poems with self-portrait, I wanted to make sure that the reader knew that that speaker was maybe a little bit closer to my own voice. But I still wanted the protection of the character, the persona, in order to get at certain topics that maybe felt a little dangerous, a little bit heavy. And so I was playing with both of those modes, the self-portrait mode and the persona mode. And I hope that it works. I kind of got in a rut of doing that and have a lot of those in this collection.
I'm not sure a rut is quite the right word, but it is. I mean, it is a repetition, and I think that for me,
well, that's kind.
Thank you. Coming back to that over and over again is really what makes these poems in particular, feel very alive for me. But also there are points in the collection where the poems are really pointing, like really foregrounding that interaction between the persona and the poet and the speaker. And the two that I'm thinking of in particular, now you're going to have to tell me how to pronounce this word anagnoresis, is that?
Anagnorisis.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two of these poems that have this word anagnorisis in the title. The first is early in the collection, Anagnorisis in the Green Room. And the second is almost all the way at the end, Anagnorisis on the Playhouse main stage. And I had to look this word up. I probably should have looked up the pronunciation while I was looking up the definition.
To be honest with you, Mike, I might be telling you it wrong. I think it's anagnorisis. I'm not sure. So we should all look up the pronunciation.
Yeah. That's the listener's homework for tonight. But I looked this word up. It's the point in a plot, especially in a tragedy, where the character realizes a hidden identity, whether it's their own true identity or someone else's true identity. And obviously that is a plot device that Shakespeare uses a lot because he has, for example, in The Winter's Tale, Perdita doesn't know where she comes from, and that's not revealed until later. There's a lot of people who disguise themselves as, one person or another, or especially if there's a lot of sort of cross-dressing that happens in like As You Like It or Twelfth Night or things like that. And the realization of the person's true identity is often a sort of climactic moment in the narrative plot of the play. And so bringing that in here into these poems, where you are writing these poems, these self-portrait poems that are in persona, but also very personal and close to yourself, as you've said. I found it so fascinating because as I actually missed the first one the first time around, and I thought it was only the second one, but on the second read through, I was like, oh no, she brings this in right at the beginning of the collection, because you can't help notice this tension, and what is the use of persona doing? But you actually are really foregrounding this. In the first one, you talk about a shield of fictive skin, or fiction being a better barrier than none. In the second one, there's a line where the second poem is really all about unmasking, right? Like taking the costume off, but how hard it is when making use of metaphor to not do that. The metaphor being perhaps a persona in and of itself, or some sort of fictive barrier. But also the line that really stuck out to me in the second one on the Playhouse main stage is where the speaker says she is weary of I. And I just thought that was such an interesting, both of these poems, like how they operate in the collection, and how they are taking this thing that could be, I mean, if you hadn't put these poems in the collection, it still would work as a collection, right? And the reader would, I mean, I've read any number of poetry collections where there is a sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word, but a sort of device that's repeated throughout, right? And that can be interesting in and of itself, but calling attention to the device as the writer while you're in the middle of doing it is really interesting to me. And I was sort of interested in what the impulse for that was.
Yeah. I have to give credit to one of my writing groups who looked at this manuscript after I finished with poem school, and I had a manuscript, and I sat down with my writing group, and they wanted more of me in the book. They wanted a reveal. They're like, these persona poems are interesting, but at some point, can you come forward a little more and kind of acknowledge what you've been doing in these persona poems and sort of step out of the persona character? So that's when these two anagnorisis poems came into being, to sort of offer a framework of like what I felt like the persona was helping me to do, this shield of fictive skin, the comfortable mask against my face, fiction better barrier than none, paint each scar, each wound's garnet portrait. But then at the end, offering some kind of key, some kind of something a little closer to nonfiction, maybe, that could help readers understand where I was coming from. So yeah, they gave me the idea of being a little more forthright, and I'm glad it made it into the collection. Or what I'm hearing you say is that it was helpful for you as a reader.
Well, I guess it's not so much that it was helpful for me, because I feel like when we read poems, we have a tendency of understanding them at, like the Dickinson quote about, telling the truth, but tell it slant. We have an understanding that oftentimes in a poem, the artist is doing something where they're going to be talking about some kind of truth, but obliquely. And I was actually just having a conversation with my friend Rachel about that tell it slant thing, which she feels is misinterpreted, and she's probably right, because she's much smarter than I am. But even so, I think a lot of us as readers of poems, we are sort of trained to try to understand a poem's meaning, not necessarily in terms of literally what's being said, but rather what are these words and images and language, whether, it's breaking the language or playing with it or whatever, that it's getting at something. And I think there's a very clear sort of narrative that's developed through this collection. And especially because the self-portrait poems, even though they are in persona, the fact that they're called self-portrait is really inviting the reader to understand the speaker as speaking through these characters rather than the characters speaking themselves. None of that is, in my opinion, requires this foregrounding of the sort of artifice of the persona form, right? But the fact that you are highlighting the fact that it is a device, right? There is an artifice to it. And I feel like that complicates it in a way that it would have been interesting without, but it's much more interesting with, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm delighted to hear that. This was a poem that I really, the longer one, the second one, Anagnorisis on the Playhouse main stage, makes me squirm a little bit because it feels more direct and doesn't have or resists the persona that had been so comfortable through most of the collection. What I kind of understand from persona is that it can help folks get close to writing content that feels difficult. It's like the fence at the edge of the ravine. you lean against the fence so you can see better into the ravine. And I was going through a difficult faith transition when I was writing these poems. And so having that fence was very comfortable. But yeah, my writing group, you tell it not quite so slant. tell it a little less slant, and that is how this poem was born. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that conversation with your friend, by the way, because now I also want to know, well, what is the real interpretation of that poem?
Well, I'll just put a little plug in here for her book. It's called The Poetics of Wrongness, Rachel Zucker.
That's on my list.
Yeah.
Yes.
So she talks about that in a couple of the essays in that collection. It's wonderful. So, well, there's like a million more things that I wanted to talk about, but we're pretty close to time for this segment. So why don't we take a little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Sounds great.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, it dovetails really nicely with what you were talking about earlier a little bit about where poems come from, because I've been thinking a lot about play. At the last AWP that was in my neck of the woods here in Seattle, one of the themes that emerged for me was play. There was one session I went to on play, but there were other craft talks and sessions that seemed to engage with the idea of play in poetry, play as inspiration. When we have writer's block, play as collaboration, play as revision, just all these ways that we as artists can and do engage with play. A former professor of mine, Tiana Kahakuila, gave a craft talk where she said play is always political and play has often been relegated to certain bodies, which I think is important to acknowledge. Absolutely. As I mentioned, I love to experiment and try different forms and different approaches. And I'm kind of fascinated with the idea of how new poems arrive and how we keep them coming. And I think play has to do with that. One of the panels that I went to, Jihan Debrow, I'm not sure I'm saying her name correctly. She said, if the work doesn't delight me, how can it charm others? I feel like our delight meter needs to register something to keep us going, to keep writing, and that we revise maybe in that mindset of play. I'm thinking about one of your, I don't know if you would call it a photo poem or a photo essay, and I hope it's okay for me to bring this into our conversation.
Sure.
Like the play of mediums, bringing I think it's called sheets, where you've got your photos and then a line of essay or prose in between each of the photos, and how those different mediums play against each other. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about play as inspiration or?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you should bring up that particular piece of mine, which I've turned into a book. I made a handmade photo book of it and it was that thing actually started just as a blog post, and it was a gift for my wife at the time. We are no longer together. I've actually had I spent a lot of time thinking about whether I want to keep that particular piece as part of my portfolio or not, because it is so personal and so specific to that specific relationship. But I think what's interesting to me is that piece, and really a lot of my photographic work, it is something that comes out of, I don't know if play is quite the right word, but it is immediate in the same way that play is immediate. Like when people are playing, when children are playing, or even adults, we're not necessarily trying to make something specific happen, right? We're just following the impulse of what feels good in a very immediate and urgent way. And play has this connotation in our sort of, very serious adult culture of being something that's unserious, something that's childish. And often that it is sort of chaotic. But what I have found, both as just an individual, but also as a parent, watching my kids play and watching them play with their friends, is that it's really, like, play is typically not completely unstructured. Like, there is some kind of scaffolding to it, but the scaffolding has a way of sort of disappearing into the play to the point where it's just following what seems to make sense. And being able to find that, we have sort of loftier ways of talking about it when we're talking about art making and the creative process, but just being able to notice what feels good to you as the artist and be willing to follow that. A lot of ways that is something that I've only ever been able, like, anytime I try to make something on purpose, it just ends up being really labored and really, often it's didactic or just really heavy handed and uninteresting, really one note. But the stuff that I've made that actually seems to actually say something or have some value to it, whether that's to me or to an audience member, it is something that's kind of come about in an almost accidental way. And I think that what you're talking about with play is something that really is a big part of that. But what's weird to me is that I only seem to be able to do this as a photographer. As a writer, I have a really hard time just like playing.
Interesting. Well, do you think that photography maybe is the play? You know what I mean? Do we sometimes switch mediums or switch art forms in order to feel that source of delight when one kind of art form is maybe feeling demanding or too heavy, that we maybe switch?
It could be.
So that we can feel that delight again and then come back to the heavier art form? Maybe.
I find for myself, the thing that always trips me up, I think, is just because part of it is just photography is a very automatic process for me. Photography is a very simple art form in a lot of ways in terms of technique. Like, you can learn everything that you need to know to become a competent photographer in 6 months. Less than that, is depending on how automatic the tools you're using are. And it gets to the point where photography is a lot more about seeing than it is about camera technique, right? And seeing is something that you kind of can't help doing. Or at least this is how it is for me. When I was married, we would go on road trips and I would always be pointing out, like, look at that. That would be a great picture. Look at that. And I couldn't stop because I was driving. And my then wife, she would say, gosh, you really can't stop doing that, can you? And with writing, I will come up with something oftentimes that I want to say in a way that I want to say it, like maybe a phrase will occur to me or an image or something like that. And it'll stick in my head. But the process, the tools are not transparent to me. They're something that I have to think about. And that's especially true with poetry. I find that it doesn't just sort of come out the way that photographs do, if that makes sense. I don't know how it is for other people, though.
Are you particularly thinking about the drafting process then, like play as inspiration rather than, do you ever find yourself being more playful with revision, for example? Like, I've written this poem, now let me try writing it as a sonnet, or let me play with writing it in different tenses or in persona.
I think for me, the truth of the matter is that I'm just really not very good at revising. My writing process, and this is probably why I tend to gravitate more towards like essay and prose than something fictional or poetry. I do write poems more than a lot of other things, though. I don't know. I think what it is, I have a tendency of just thinking about stuff for a long time until it's ready to come out, and then it all kind of just comes out. And, that process can take me, a week or to 10 years. So with poetry, I find that I have to, if I'm going to write an essay, it'll typically happen like that. Is I'll have an idea and I'll think about it for a while, and then it doesn't take me very long to write once I actually sit down to write it. But getting to the point of being ready to sit down and write it can take a while.
Yeah.
And then the revision process, typically there's not like I might move stuff around a little bit. I might move a sentence here or there. I might change a wording here and there, but mostly it's pretty close. Like, whereas with a poem, I've never been happy with a poem on the first draft, but then because of the way that I think about writing and the way that writing and I interact with each other, it's sort of, it gets hard for me to do something to where I can change a poem into something completely different. Like what you were saying, like maybe write this in a different form or write this in persona now or something like that, where it's like a really big structural change. Mm-hmm. It's hard for it to even occur to me that that's something that you could do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think because I'm in this pressurized challenge of trying to write a poem a day this month, I am resorting to those kinds of big structural revision. I don't have to think of a new topic. I can write this same poem, the same idea, same topic, but write it as a villanelle this time and see what happens. And the pressure of the form brings out different ideas and takes the poem sometimes in an entirely different direction. So it comes out a very different poem, even though I started out with the same idea. I don't know. I will also have something that I'll think about for a while before sometimes it will come out into poem form. And I like drafting by hand. And then I will move that draft into a Google Doc. But then every time I make a change, I copy and paste the whole poem and date it beneath the version that came before, so that I feel free to change it drastically as much as I want. So there's like the old draft that I can fall back on, like my safety net, but then I can really experiment and explode it in the next iteration if I want to, because I know I've got the draft of it that came before just sitting there if I need to go back to it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you revise in a similar way, like in an iterative kind of way like that?
It depends on what I'm doing. With poetry, I do something that's more like that. I don't always start a whole new document, but I, just make a page break and try to leave things so that I have like a trail of breadcrumbs that I can follow if I need to.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think more than anything, to come back to this idea of play, it's that writing is so much more of like a purposeful thing for me that I get stuck on stuff. And so revising is something I actually just really find to be awful. And I'm always really envious of these writers who say that they can have fun in the revision process. Because for me, revising often just feels like beating my head against a wall. And I think part of it too is that I'll get stuck feeling like like that what I've already done with the first draft or second draft or whatever is like I cling to it a little too much, I think part of this is just like having not spent enough time actually doing it. But I find it really interesting that because I know a lot of writers who like to do first drafts longhand, and I have never been able to do that. Part of it is that my when I'm writing with a pen or something, I can't keep up with my brain as much as because I can type much faster. But also part of it is that when I'm writing on paper, I have this tendency of freezing up because I feel like it's so hard it takes me so long to write compared to how fast I type. And then also you can't delete stuff. So I feel like this block where I have to, like, if I can't get it out right the first time, and especially if I'm writing in pen, then it's hard to even put the pen to paper at all. I feel more of this pressure to get it right if I'm writing longhand than if I'm just typing. It feels less consequential somehow. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's like a right or a wrong way to do these things. Lots of people, draft on a computer and that's fine. But I've always been envious of people because it always sounds lovely, you know, the feeling of the pen on the paper and, you know, making things more tactile and, you know,
romanticized a bit. Yeah. Well, it certainly is slower. It is certainly slower. I think for a lot of people, it feels actually lower stakes than typing it into a document, because from document to submission, that's closer. You're not going to submit something, usually is not going to go to print what you're scribbling into your notebook, right? And so it feels, for me, more like play. I can just cross something out if that's not working. I can write around and above and all over in a notebook, where I work in a research and writing studio in an academic library, and I see a lot of folks who come in with writer's block. And one of the first things I do is shut the computer. I close the computer and I give them a piece of paper. And I was like, okay, you're going to use a pen and it's going to slow you down. And I'm going to give you a timer and I'm going to come back in 8 minutes. And I want you to write as much as you can on this topic on paper. And I haven't had that not work yet. Like moving somebody away from their computer and away from where they can't. I guess they could take a picture and submit something to their teacher if they were wanting to do it but usually not. Usually it has to be typed up, right? So closing the computer and putting that paper and pen in front of them with the gentle pressure of a timer is a wonderful remedy for writer's block for a lot of folks. But I agree, there's no right way to do it. Do you ever try dictate? Do you ever try speaking your poem into your phone?
I've never tried that, but it's this might surprise you, considering that, you know, my main creative outlet is speaking into a microphone. But composing orally is something that it just seems like magic to me, because I usually have to really take a long way back and run up to it before I can know what I'm going to be saying with any kind of clarity. I do think that this idea of playing, though, is so important. When I get stuck on something with writer's block, it's almost always because the idea of what I'm trying to do gets in the way of me doing it, because I have some expectation that the end product is going to be a certain way, that it will provoke certain emotions or responses in the reader, or at least in myself, that it will be beautiful in a certain way or ugly in a certain way, but that it will be what I set out for it to be. And I think that is the biggest difference between writing and photography for me, is that photography is always about exploration for me. I know it's not that way for everybody, but for me, photography is just about seeing what's out there. And in that respect, I can't really have an expectation of what will be. I think that being able to just follow what feels good as a writer seems like, well, one, it seems nice, but also it seems much more productive to me, you know?
Yeah. I'm not sure what to add to that. I'm a baby photographer, like a photographer with a little P. I just started taking photos during the pandemic, so just a few years ago. And I'm not a professional by any stretch of the imagination, but I love macro photography and zooming up really close on things and restranging the world as I understand it by looking at something that closely.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you find that is also an impulse as a writer, zooming in and looking at things closely?
Sometimes. I think that both macro photography and poems give me a sense of control where I don't have very much of that in reality. You know what I mean? I can decide exactly what's going to be in the frame and how close I want to be to the subject and just zoom in on that tiny thing and a poem as well, right? It's compact. It's one page usually, or unless we're talking about an epic poem here, but I like that small space. So maybe that is the similarity between the two. They're compact and controlled.
Well, I think that we're getting close to time here, but there is one question that I always like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes. Just the other day, I got in my mailbox a brand new collection of poems. It is by my poetry mentor, Bruce Beasley. It's from Orison Books, and the title is Prayer Shreds. I think that the official release date is not actually till early May. So it's brand new. Bruce Beasley is a wonderful poet. He's brilliant. He plays with language in just incredible, mind-bending ways. And he's a generous mentor and continues to support me in my poetry and my poetic life. And I've read about half of it. I just got it in the mail yesterday, and it is just a word feast. It's delightful.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I highly recommend it if you're interested in playing with language, in theology. Bruce's new book is incredible.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure and put a link in the show notes to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
So did I, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copies of Oh Lady Speak Again. And if you'd like to hear Dayna's bonus reading, you can sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/likewisemedia. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, help spread the word. Share the episode with a poetry lover you know. You can also help out the show and put a huge smile on my face by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.